everyone, you're now watching Debating One-on-One with Sammie. Since this is the first episode of the show, a quick introduction is needed to explain how the show has begun. So the Sammie you all know is currently a show host, but she was trained for debating in high school, and thanks to her amazing team, they were crowned champion for the first ICSS English debating competition back in 2012. And she had also advanced into the semi-finals upon her first attempt for joining the Queen's University Belfast internal mooting competition back in 2014. So before we begin the show, disclaimer. The contents of this video is purely for entertainment purposes and to appreciate the true art of debating by using facts and logics. And there is no intention to attack, nor offend, nor mock any parties being used as an example or reference to support their motion. It is a pure reflection of the two inner voices wanting to express their views and to debate against each other. And we would like to invite our fellow audiences to also respect both points of views. So one of the hottest news trending recently is the newly eliminated MasterChef Australia star Sarah Tiong, who accuses Triple M, an Australian radio station, of racism after being greeted by the host in Mandarin Chinese. Hence, the motion of the day is, this house believes that assuming someone can speak the language of their ethnicity is not racism. The government would support the motion while the opposition would be going against it. Debating style is going to be in parliamentary style, but the shortened version. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and the government believes that assuming someone can speak the language of their ethnicity is not racism. And in order for the opposition to prove that, they need to prove the elements defined by the authorities on the definition of racism. Which leads to the first point of the government, which is definition of racism, firstly made by the Oxford Dictionary. Racism means prejudice, discrimination, antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Keyword: prejudice, discrimination, antagonism, and superior. Second definition, based on the Oxford Advanced Learners Dictionary, racism means an unfair treatment or violent behavior directed against people who belong to a different race and think that they are better than others. And the third definition, by Oxford Reference, where racism means a devaluation of various traits or refusal to recognize their rights, their needs, and dignity. From these definitions, we lead to two levels to support point number one. On the first level, looking at the actions of the Australian radio station. On the facts, the Australian radio host has merely greeted her in a language that they think what her ethnicity is. There is no indication of which race is more superior or inferior in the sentence, as the actual words they used was Lei Hou Ma and Ni Hao Ma, which means how are you in the respective languages, which are common dialects among the Chinese as well. POIs please. Well, you had just mentioned what they think their ethnicity is. Don't you think greeting someone else in a language that they may not understand just based on their skin color is rude? Well, it is universal that any kind of culture would have taught us to greet someone else by saying how are you or how do you do in their mother tongue. And my question to the opposition is, how does practicing basic manners and courtesy constitute of being rude to others? That is even more far-fetched to say is racism, as there's no prejudice, no discrimination or antagonism in a greeting by saying how are you, unless they had greeted her in a foul language or vulgar words which are not supposed to be used as a greeting. But based on the facts, it is not. It is just mainly how are you, and we don't think saying how are you or I love you in different languages, despite the other person might not understand it, considers to be rude. It should be a beautiful thing. And by the way, this is an open era for us to celebrate the differences of languages and cultural identity. Moving on to the second level to support point one, which is to look at the actions of the Australian radio station. It is definitely not insulting to state her name as it is, and there is a clear distinction between the definition of misunderstanding and being racist, as the former means it's an innocent mistake made by the party about the culture's identity, while the latter means intentionally displaying hostility against one's cultural identity. Now, take a popular meme as an example, where how Asians think all whites look the same and how whites think Asians look all the same. It is because the world is so big and diverse, and if we are not born or raised or even exposed to the specific ethnicity much, it is common to have misunderstandings, and that shouldn't constitute as racism, as it is just a mistake. Moreover, as a professional media body, it is obvious that the Australian radio host, by saying "How are you?" in Cantonese out of courtesy, does not contain any malicious intention to mock one's cultural identity or to think which race is more superior or inferior, but instead it is to show hospitality and quoted from On Hand Agrarian. Open quote, making efforts to notice someone's features and mannerism to acknowledge what they thought was her culture, which is the exact opposite of racism. It's called courtesy. Closing quote. As again, for racism to establish, the opposition needs to prove that the element of the indication of a specific race is more superior than the other has to be present. The classic example of this would be the most recent news about an American black, George Floyd, being nailed to death by a US cop, which his actions directly implemented that the blacks were at a inferior position, which that was truly disturbing, and that was actual racism happening in the current century. Why this motion must stand also leads to point number 2, where the government believes that the way Sarah Tiong had marketed herself by associating heavily with the Chinese culture by making Chinese cuisines could have contributed to the confusion of her cultural identity. It is arguable that the entire situation is just a big genuine mistake between the both parties because, as pointed out by On Hand Agrarian, open quote, Sarah Tiong is a farmer who proudly grows heritage foods from the ASEAN region, had been happily cashing in by the way she markets herself with her pigmentation to push her pig agenda. Closing quote. By making Chinese cuisines such as bak kut teh and having a Chinese surname certainly would have contributed why people can mistakenly about her ethnicity and thought she could speak the language. And again, all the host asked her was the most basic of the language, which means, how are you? Based on Sarah's own statement, quoted from On Hand Agrarian, open quote, would it be racist if someone gave her chopsticks, a Chinese chef's knife, a packet of bak kut teh spices, invited her to a kimchi tasting event? Evidently not. Closing quote. And with that, the government has one last question to pose to the opposition. Wouldn't Sarah's action by denying her roots with reference to such heritage by rejecting the language considers racism instead? And number 2, why is it not offensive to be associated with every details of the Chinese culture except the language? And with that, the government urged the parliament to affirm the motion as assuming one can speak the language of their ethnicity is not racism. Otherwise, it is absurd. 如果唔係周街都係 racism 咯，如果唔係周街都係 racism 咯。